That's right. We'll wake you up. Good evening, everybody, and welcome tonight to Connecticut's Old State House, to our program about the Amistad. We're so happy to have people here in person, and we are so happy to have many people watching online. We welcome everybody, whether you're here or at home. If you're here, you are in a beautiful, beautiful building, a building that served as Connecticut's state capitol starting in 1796. But it is also an incredibly historic building. A lot of events occurred here that affected Connecticut history, but also national and international history, and we're going to talk about some of that tonight. In this very room, on September 17th, in 1839, the Amistad trials began. So we couldn't be in a more appropriate place for this discussion. This room was filled with drama and hope and fear and confusion, and it was a place that helps us keep the Amistad story in our minds, in our hearts, and in our memories. So it's a very important room and space for those reasons. Around the room you will see some panels and pictures. This is our Amistad exhibit that was created by Mariana Garcia. And Mariana also is the person who put this program together with our wonderful partners at El Instituto. Unfortunately, Mariana couldn't be here tonight, which is very unfortunate because this is her first year as our manager of public programs and exhibits, and she really wanted to be here to see everybody and to be part of this program. She is watching from home, so that's good. There are also a lot of important dates converging to make this the perfect moment for this program. 2022 is the Amistad film's 25th anniversary, which is arguably the first time most people learned about the Amistad story. It's also the anniversary of the start of the trial right here in this courtroom, and it's Hispanic Heritage Month. The Amistad story shows how Latin American and North American history are inextricably entwined. We are the Old State House, but we rarely do anything without partners. We believe that everything runs on good partnerships, and we are so proud to be partners with El Instituto. We have been particularly happy to work with Sam Martinez, and he has retired from his work with El Instituto, but we look forward to working with Catarina, and I am so grateful every day that Mariana forged this beautiful partnership with you, and we look forward to continuing it. El Instituto is a multidisciplinary research and teaching institute that advances scholarship, creative endeavors, undergraduate and graduate instruction, and academic advising across multiple disciplines in the fields of Latino and Latin American studies. Its mission is to advance knowledge about the lives of Latino people in Connecticut, nationwide and around the world, as well as to provide support for research on Caribbean and Latin America related topics to UConn students and faculty. We are so happy to be working with El Instituto. And I should also say it's a good partnership for us because I always think of the Old State House as the place where civics and history meet. This is where those things come together, where people can learn about the past and take action into the future. So we look for partners who are interested not just in studying the past, but carrying stories and action forward. So that's one reason why we love working with this organization. I'm also very happy to introduce our moderator for this evening. Dr. Melina Papademos earned a BA from Cornell University, her MA from the University of Illinois, and her PhD in history from New York University. Her research and teaching interests focus on the social and cultural history of race, social and political mobilizations and nationalisms, particularly of people of African descent in the Caribbean and Latin American. Supported by such institutions as New York University, the Ford Foundation, Harvard University, Wesleyan University, and the U.S. Department of Education's Fulbright-Hays Research Program, Dr. Papademos published her first book, Black Political Activism and the Cuban Republic. The book was awarded the 2012 Murdo J. McLeod Best Book Prize from the Southern Historical Association Latin American and Caribbean section. It reconstructs the historical patterns of Black Cuban political activism and the relationship to the political structures and cultures of the Cuban Republic. Her second book project, funded by the University of Connecticut Research Foundation large grant and a National Academy of Sciences and Ford Foundation postdoctoral fellowship, examines racial symbolism during Cuba's turbulent 1930s and 1940s. We are very appreciative that you stepped in for Mariana as the moderator tonight. We love people who do things for us when we ask them at the last minute. We are very grateful, and we're grateful to all of you for being here tonight. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Sally, for that. We haven't spoken face-to-face, but we've corresponded over email, so I'm looking forward to the moment when we can meet in person. And, and when Samuel Martinez, who's the former director of El Instituto, when he wrote to me and asked me if I could moderate, I was really excited to do so because I think this is really an incredible opportunity. We have some historians here, 2 here in person and 1 online. To really discuss this piece of film that really had a large impact 25 years ago, and that reflective, and this reflective moment, I think, is really enlightening and important to do. One thing I have been asked to say, that we will have Q&A, both for folks online as well as folks in the room. If you are in the room, please raise your hand so that a mic can be brought over to you, because they're recording this event and need your voice, on recording. As well, for people who are at home, please make sure you submit questions to the chat. Okay, without further ado, our first guest is also my colleague. What a great colleague he is. Dr. Dexter Gabriel earned his BA in history from Texas State University, San Marcos, an MA in history also from Texas State University, San Marcos, and his PhD in history from Stony Brook University, New York. His research interests include the history of bondage, resistance, and freedom in the Black Atlantic, as well as interdisciplinary approaches to slavery within popular culture and media. His current research explores British emancipation in the Anglo-Caribbean and its impact on abolitionist strategies in 19th century North America. His work has been translated into the social arena through panel discussions, lectures, articles, and interviews as diverse as the Federal Reserve Bank of Virginia to Voice of America, BBC, and elsewhere. So it's a pleasure to have you here. Thank you. Dr. Gabriel. The second person, our second guest, is online. I believe we will see him shortly, is Dr. Dan J. Broyld. There he is. Hi, Dr. Broyld. He is an associate professor of African American history at the University of Massachusetts Lowell. He earned his PhD in 19th century United States and African diaspora history at Howard University. His work focuses on the American-Canadian borderlands and issues of Black identity, migration, and transnational relations, as well as oral history, material culture, and museum community interactions. Broyld was a 2017-2018 Fulbright Canada Scholar at Brock University, and his book, Borderland Blacks, 2 Cities in the Niagara Region During the Final Decades of Slavery, is published with Louisiana State University Press, fresh off the press this year. And finally, our final panelist is Dr. Jorge Felipe-González, who is an assistant professor in the Department of History at the University of Texas, San Antonio. He earned his PhD in Atlantic History at Michigan State University with a dissertation, Foundation and Growth of the Cuban-Based Transatlantic Slave Trade, a project built upon a decade of research in Cuban, British, Spanish, and American archives. Dr. Felipe-González has published in The Atlantic, the New York Review of Books, and the Journal of African History. He has been involved as editor and contributor of the Transatlantic and Inter-American Slave Trade databases since 2014. As a postdoctoral fellow at the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research at Harvard University in 2019-2020, he developed the digital database People of the Atlantic Trade with historian David Eltis. Dr. Felipe-González has taught in both Cuba and the United States. His more recent courses include the graduate seminars Teaching and Researching the Transatlantic Slave in the Digital Age, and the United States Slave Trade, and upper-level undergraduate courses such as Slavery and Its Legacy in the Digital Age. He has been awarded multiple grants, including an Australia Research Council grant to develop a digital database on the forced transportation of South Pacific Islanders to Cuba. Next academic year, Dr. Felipe-González will be a postdoctoral fellow at the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research to complete his book, The Cuban Slave Trade in Atlantic History. So welcome to our three panelists. It's really, again, just such a great collection of knowledge and researchers and historians right now. So, Amistad.
The Amistad.
Yeah. Steven Spielberg. You know, I was telling Dr. González earlier that I reviewed Amistad this very afternoon, in fact, and was sort of trying to think about, do the racial messages fit that were, sort of on tap in the turn of the century? Do they fit now in 2022? I guess my first question is just to get us kind of started. What were your thoughts about the movie? When you first saw it, if you can recall those impressions. A couple of two and a half decades ago. I mean, what did you think?
I see everyone looking at me. So, I was doing the same. I was trying to remember my thoughts of the film, and it's funny, I wasn't a historian at the time. I wasn't in grad school at the time, so I saw the film, I say, as a civilian. I remember seeing it with my parents, and what I remember most about the film is actually a lot of the talk behind the film. I remember that the film was a really big deal. It was on the front cover of Newsweek. There was a segment on it on Nightline, if everyone remembers Nightline, the old show, really going back a few decades. Yep. There were newspaper write-ups. There was controversy with Spike Lee and others. I remember Spike Lee famously calling Morgan Freeman's character furniture in the film. And so there was just a lot of buzz going into it. It was seen as this important film because the public was going to talk about slavery. And so I went into it not knowing what to expect. I'd heard of the Amistad Rebellion before. I knew rudimentary notions of it. So I went in with some understanding of it. And I remember my feeling about seeing the film was, okay, there were some nice scenes in here. And when I left, I felt like, well, that was a lot. There's a lot in that film. And I don't remember leaving with a dramatic feeling of when I finished seeing it, like, wow, I need to see this again. In fact, I don't remember seeing it again until much later in grad school as I'm developing a course on slavery and film. Yep. And I returned to see it. And I think then I saw it with fresh eyes, with more informed eyes. And then I came to appreciate it for some of its stronger qualities. And I also found criticism in it for, I think, where it had failings. And then like you, though I still teach the course, I hadn't watched it perhaps in 5 years. So I watched it again this weekend. That's probably a lot of people did. And I remember thinking like, oh, well, that's nice. And like, oh, wow, really? Really? And that was my feeling as I went through it. So I think I still have a lot of complicated feelings about the film.
Yeah.
Right? And I think many people do, and that's probably why we're here.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I watched the movie 2 days ago for the second time. The first time I was a teenager and I watched it in Havana, Cuba. And the reason why I did is because it was a Spielberg movie, and Spielberg is a big deal, so why not? And why this movie has this Spanish name, Amistad, which was interesting to me. And I started watching the movie and say, okay, there is a slave rebellion. That's interesting. I didn't know about the Amistad, which is something that we can discuss why in Cuba we didn't know about the Amistad. At some point I was at high school, I think. And then it turns out that part of the movie happens in Cuba. And Cuba is mentioned multiple times, and I didn't know why. I was completely clueless. So everything that had to do with the history, about the story of the Amistad, the rebellion, the legal case, I just learned while watching the movie that day. And I was really impressed, and I was like, oh, this is interesting. And I realized how little I knew, not only about the Amistad at that point, but about the transatlantic slave trade at large, because that's something that we don't learn in high school in Cuba. So, and the Amistad served a purpose for me.
Yeah, sure. Professor Broyld.
Yes. Cheers, everyone. I'm so glad to be here with you all remotely. So my first thoughts on the Amistad was that it was long.
It's very long.
And that is partly because I was in high school. The other thing that I thought is that it was very white and American-centered. And the two reasons I thought that is because my first introduction to slavery in film was Alex Haley's Roots, the saga of an American family, which came out as a miniseries in 1977. And so I grew up watching that. And so from watching The Roots by Alex Haley and watching, the Amistad, there are clear differences in perspectives and who's kind of narrating the story.
Yeah. I had a similar reaction, but I wonder, to just think about the kind of scholarly, you're all producers of history, you all critique historical narrative. You're scholars and researchers. That's what we do for a living. And I wonder if you thought, if you were under the impression that there was actually kind of two stories happening with one subordinated to the other. For example, in the opening scene, Cinque, played by the actor Jimon Hunsu, is digging out. His life is dependent on his ability to dig out this nail out of the shipboards to be able to, unlock his chain and set himself and others free. I just wonder if that seems to be subordinated to you, more important to you. I mean, what do you think? Why would Spielberg, do you think, open with that?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
Especially, I think, in seeing the film for the first time and not knowing precisely what was true, what wasn't true, what was factual, what was made up for Hollywood. I think it came looking at it later and finding out, the revolt was actually a bit more premeditated, that there were instigating factors, that they thought about it, that they planned it out, that there were three girls who saw the cane knives and informed these men of them, right? So that there was all this backstory. And I came to learn that after, and it helped answer some questions in my own head of why did Spielberg start with this one scene? A scene which I remember when I first saw it, it was a bizarre scene to me. I thought that there was, I can't think of another word, there's almost a bestial quality in the way Jimon Hansu was portrayed. We never hear him really speak during that scene. He's more so making noises. And I think what really struck me was when I actually understood the larger history, how much of it had been changed for the purpose of Hollywood media, right? And we can talk about the many changes that take place within this film, but I think some of it has to do with Spielberg deciding that he wanted to speak about the rebellion, but he really wanted to make this about this courtroom drama that had to do with American nationalism and patriotism and history, right? And it has to do with the score. And so that's one thing about the movie, that it at times feels disjointed because it doesn't seem to know what it wants to be. And it ends up landing in this courtroom drama, and it keeps bringing us back in some ways to what happens with the actual rebellion. And you sometimes wonder what would have happened if this film had been created centered not only on the perspective of the Africans themselves, so we get to see them actually speak, we get subtitles for them for the first 30 minutes of the movie instead of now we don't, But what if it had been focused on the rebellion itself? And where the courtroom drama was subordinated to it, right? And it has to do with the choices, I think, that any director makes in telling and saying the type of story he wants to tell, and him thinking about who his audience is, right? And so, yeah.
I think there are two stories going on here. One is the story of the rebellion and liberation from below by the slaves. And another one is that plays on the courtroom. So the abolitionist movement that is happening not only in the United States, but also in England. So, and this is, I think one merit of the movie, and it's great that the movie starts actually with the rebellion, and with this moment, this painful moment of this guy trying to take that screw, right, from the ship. And I think it's good that it starts there because the director is highlighting that in this picture, the most important part is the rebellion. The rebellion is the triggering factor for everything that happened after that. But at the same time, you cannot ignore the other part, the legal abolitionist court that is happening, because both are occurring simultaneously. And it's also a metaphor to what is going on everywhere. In the Caribbean, you have the Haitian Revolution, an example from below, where you have the parliament fighting for the freedom of Africans, not only by white people, but also Africans who are trying to push for the end of the slave trade. So I think that point is a balanced type of perspective in the movie.
Yeah, I think that the courtroom is an interesting space, particularly for Black people, right? And so the fact that this is happening in a courtroom, it kind of scared me. I mean, my dad gave me a tutorial on, what the Amistad was before I watched it, but it really kind of made me nervous that it was happening in a courtroom, right? Because usually that's where, Black people are wrongly accused, right? They're poorly represented, right? And so I thought that it was even kind of the irony of being so set in a courtroom with these kind of politics happening around Black freedom was just quite interesting for me. And I would have preferred, for, more to be on the rebellion and things of that nature. Also, too, just hearing the voices of the Black people, I think it's very interesting. Marcus Rediker's book, I believe it was published in 2012. The first chapter is just voices, right? And you just get to hear these kind of African voices, and the Black people really kind of speak for themselves. Right?
Yeah, so I think what all of you are bringing up are really, I think we could sort of go in two different directions in terms of the film. On the one hand, if we could take a moment to talk about the kind of broader narrative that was truncated and compacted. For example, as a historian of the Cuban slave trade, what was missing about the narrative that Spielberg either chose artistically to not include it, or didn't think it was important, or didn't know how to include it in the right way? Like, what was missing? What didn't we get from Cuba? Because this is a much larger process than we saw in the film.
Right. Yeah. I think Cuba is shown for like a couple of minutes.
Yeah.
It's only the moment when the enslaved arrived in Havana, which, by the way, that's not how the slave trade works at the time. It was illegal, so slaves just don't disembark in the city and were sold like that. But that took like 2 minutes, I think. By the broader picture is that the same year that the Amistad rebellion took place, 20,000 Africans were disembarked in Cuba. 20,000. So that's high amount of number. In total, in Cuba arrived about 1 million of them. So the Amistad is the only exceptional case where you have this slave rebellion being successful. And the Amistad work in the bigger picture of the Cuban sugar plantation economy. The slave trade was illegal in Cuba at that point. The Spanish authorities abolished slavery in 1820. And that's why at this point, in 1839, the Amistad was largely illegal. And that's partially why they were able to get their freedom in the court here in Connecticut, so in the Supreme Court. And yeah, the big picture is that it's an illegal slave trade. There is the authorities in Cuba, immorally and illegally, are importing thousands of Africans annually to the island. And the last slave ship to arrive in the Americas arrived in Cuba in 1867, like after the Civil War, which is impressive.
Yeah. Cuba was the next to last. The abolition of slavery happened in Cuba next to last. Brazil was the latest. So for those who are thinking about when did actually the abolition of slavery happen outside of the U.S., we tend to be very U.S. focused as a historian of the Caribbean. So 1888 in Brazil and 1886 in Cuba.
Yes.
I also, the other sort of thread that I think, your responses have brought to my mind at least is that Amistad seemed to have set a kind of tone for film and the way race and racism is handled in the U.S. So following Amistad, we had Django Unchained, 12 Years a Slave, Antebellum, Beloved, Harriet, Roots, the Roots remake, I should say.
Yeah.
Belle, Birth of a Nation, focusing on Nat Turner, and so on and so on. What does that say about what slavery seems to indicate about where we are in this country in terms of race and racism, anti-Black violence, for example? What do you think that Spielberg unwittingly unleashed in terms of the commercial use of slave history as a vehicle to talk about race and racism today?
Yeah, what's interesting about those movies you just named, for instance, is that, there's this great debate, like there are all of these slave movies, but if you actually go back in the past and look at American cinema anyway, and slave movies, like before really Roots, you had a lot of plantation epics. Then during the blaxploitation era, we have these few blaxploitation slave films. And then Roots 1977 really breaks the mold, gives us this miniseries on television that brings in all of these people, right, to watch it and gives us this sweeping narrative of slavery from the perspective of enslaved people and what have you. Shows us the Middle Passage, which a lot of earlier films had mostly focused on the period just before the Civil War in the United States, but it gives us the Middle Passage, it gives us Africa. And yet after that, Hollywood, big screen Hollywood, doesn't really touch slave movies for a while. Like the next time we get a big movie is Glory in 1989, right? Which is about the American Civil War again, and it's about these 3 enslaved people in the 54th Massachusetts. And then slavery kind of disappears, at least in a large, big budget way, from the movie theaters again. And Amistad brings it back. But you think about that time, 1989 to 1997 is when we get it again, right? And so one of the reasons there's all this talk about this film is because it seems at times we outsource our discussion, our national discussions in the United States on slavery to film. And the Amistad comes along at this time when we didn't have a whole lot. And so between that time of Amistad, we then get this other lull where we don't really have a lot of big major films that are really majorly funded by Hollywood. But then you're right, sometime in the early 2000s, in like 2012, we get a burst. We get Django, we get 12 Years a Slave, and we've kind of been on a roll of getting, and we're actually living in a time that's different in the history of American cinema and slavery. We haven't had films like this on slavery. Yeah. And so I don't know if Amistad births it because there's just such a long period, but certainly Amistad, I think, is within that longer legacy, especially for films that are trying to talk about slavery, talk about history, and people go back to it for its good qualities as well as for many people see its failings, the white savior complex and other things. And so I think we see a lot of films, 12 Years a Slave and the rest, trying to remedy some of those issues and trying to give us different depictions. And by the way, with 12 Years a Slave, we get one of the first major films that has a Black director about slavery, which was hard to find outside, at least on the big screen, outside of Alex Haley and Roots and so forth. Yeah.
Yeah. Doc, I'm gonna turn to you, Dr. Broyld. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think there has been this kind of wave of slavery movies. And I think it's interesting too, because the Amistad, like if you look at the prophets of the Amistad, I mean, Spielberg really kind of proves that a movie on slavery can also do well at the box office, right? And that's kind of the interesting dynamic. And so I find that these movies are good, kind of the more modern movies are good for provocation, because what they do is they give us the story and more people kind of look for more information. And I think that that's great, because people are also looking for what's like wrong in the films, right? Which I think is awesome, right? That's also what you want to look for. You don't want to passively just kind of take in the movie and say, I know about the Amistad, I know about, 12 Years a Slave or Solomon Northrum, right? And so people are also kind of looking for what's wrong in the films. But there is this white savior that is there. I'm kind of looking for the slave film that is more, showing the anger and the aggressiveness of Black people pursuing their freedom. But I do think that it kind of depicts the time that people are more open to looking at a film on slavery. I just hope that the films on slavery do a little bit more to really show the Black voice, and also to show, how Black people aggressively were pursuing their freedom, right? I mean, the Amistad, clearly they're aggressively pursuing their freedom, and we are kind of void of that in the film in many ways.
That raises for me, why does Hollywood have such a hard time, speaking to Black humanity, Black voice, Black anger? Like, why, they're either unwilling or unable to craft a narrative that really, is immersed in that kind of a framework as opposed to a white savior framework.
So can I start with this one?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. So I think that Black feminists have done a great job with really portraying the anger of Black people. People like Brittany C. Cooper with Elegant Rage. She's talking about Black rage, right? Dr. Manisha Sherry, she has A Case for Rage, a new book that just came out in 2021. And then there's also people like Kelly Jackson Carter talking, or her book title is Force and Freedom, right? And so these Black feminist historians are really saying, are making the case that, anger is okay sometimes. And when you're enslaved and you're showing anger, or, you're oppressed and you show anger, it's okay in a sense, right? Because you're pursuing, freedom, right? Mm-hmm. And, when whites pursue freedom and they have anger and violence, right, it's looked at as okay, right? It's justified, right? So I think that they're doing a phenomenal job of just bringing anger to the table, bringing violence to the table. When is political violence okay, right? You know what I mean? And so I think that they're doing an excellent job by bringing this to the table, because many times in the classroom, our students want to know that. Clearly these people were upset. What did they do, right? How did they pursue their freedom in ways that were not nonviolent, right? In ways that showed their anger and aggression, and stuff like that. So I think that that's an important part of showing the full humanity of Black people.
I was thinking that I'm having a hard time trying to apply the white savior, which we saw that, for example, in the Green Book, the movie. Was more evident there. But I'm having a hard time to apply that to this movie, to use it for this movie. This movie starts with a clear, very graphic act of violence, slave rebellion. And it's there. The violence is there. And it's not sugar-coated. It's very clear. And that violence is, after an overtime, presented for what it is, an act of resistance and a fight for freedom. And in this movie, the idea of a white savior, there are many kind of whites in these movies, to put it somehow. So you have a president, Van Buren, who at some point is allied to the Queen Elizabeth, trying to return these people to Cuba to be re-enslaved. You have the prosecutor. You have Africans, an African-American abolitionist. You have people who are against the freedom of these others. So there are many characters happen to be white there. And ultimately, the case was won because of existing law that was passed in 1808 that banned the transatlantic slave trade. So I wonder, how is that a case of white savior? How this movie could have been done, excluding this law and excluding all this set of law that were written according to Anglo-European code of laws. So I'm having a problem reimagining this movie in which these factors are not part of the equation.
Yeah, I guess I would say this. I think that we have to think of films as multi-million-dollar endeavors and projects and commodities which have to please a lot of people. And so it's simply the political economy of film. We see the type of films we do, whether it's slavery or otherwise, on race, because there is a decision that's made that this is what audiences will tolerate, that certain audiences need these. And so sometimes we'll have a white savior. Sometimes we'll have a white ally. Even Django Unchained, the ultimate fantasy of the resistant slave, has to have a white mentor along the way. And a lot of this has to do with simply, again, on what people think audiences will allow. And when we start thinking about films, we have to think that people choose what to focus on in these films, right? And so yes, I think the Amistad film, for instance, I don't know how it would not be part of a courtroom drama, but I can see it, envision it as much more part of also the rebellion, right? On trying to find some type of greater balance there to the rebellion and the way the Africans are depicted. Again, I would love to have the Africans actually, like you talked about in the Rediger book, with their voices negotiating and talking on the ship rather than these bodily movements where they almost come across as noble savages, where they strip off all their clothes and set fires. I mean, who sets a fire inside a room to begin with? It doesn't even make sense. And so we see all of these things brought in because it's thought that, this is what will appeal to audiences and this is what audiences may want to see. And, these are just all choices. And so I think we're getting better choices today. I think as we're especially seeing, as you pointed out, not only within historians, but within social cultural critics and others, we're seeing new directors and we're seeing new ideas. I think if Amistad was made today, it would be a slightly different movie. Yeah. Right? And I think it's always a choice. So I always think, like, we haven't seen a movie on Frederick Douglass yet. Even when they were making the movie Lincoln, another big movie, there were thoughts about making the movie between Lincoln and Douglass, but that was scrapped. Decided to make it focus mostly on Lincoln. Imagine what a different movie that would be if it was a movie between Lincoln and Douglas, right? As these going back and forth. And so these are all choices people make, and they make these choices. And certainly in Amistad, there are a lot of choices made in how the film is going to be presented in 1997. That may not be made, that I think could not have been done in 1987, and I think would not be repeated in 2020 something. Right? Because we're just simply having different audiences, and there are certain things these audiences are going to endure that others wouldn't. Yeah.
Do you think that blackness is treated any differently from 1997 to 2022? I mean, in film, or with one of the more recent films like Harriet, or is blackness fundamentally understood, and black humanity, and some of the things that you were saying, Dr. Broyld, are they treated, seen any differently? Is there more of a willingness to become more proximate, more closer to that experience, to these experiences, and from 1997 to 2022?
I wouldn't say one thing. I think perhaps a new Amistad might find a way to bring in black women. to bring in the larger Black community who is very much involved in fundraising. They're the ones who fund the money, where it's a cause celebrity within Black communities. And we get Jodson, this fictional character, that's this composite, and I'm glad he's there at all, but maybe we might find a way to bring in Pennington. Maybe we might go to a Black church in the community and see these women auxiliary groups and others raising funds and, see the pamphlets that African Americans are creating. And so I think that certainly today, I think people are probably thinking about this in a much more complex way because, the Blackness that we saw in that Amistad, like somebody said, Singbe in this Amistad is some mix of Tupac and Nelson Mandela, right? And I think today people would be wondering, where are the women here? What's going on? Where is the larger community? And I think in that sense, I think Blackness would be approached hopefully differently by different directors in a modern day period.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yes, did you want to?
Yeah, I thought too, just from reading some of the historical records in Connecticut, and even from the film, I thought that, Black people were looked at, really as kind of like a spectacle, like come see these Africans. I mean, they're even doing like performances and stuff like that. And I thought that was, really interesting. I always say that, Black people are kind of looked at in two ways, really, either as superhuman or subhuman, right? And they're not looked at as human, right? And so, these kind of super and sub things kind of come through in the film. And I think that is a predominant perspective in which, Black people are looked at. But I was really interested, when I looked at the historical records, like in Connecticut, not so much that people were like interested in the court case, they're kind of interested in coming to see the Africans as almost a spectacle, right? Almost like a polka dotted elephant or something. You know what I mean? It was just this kind of weird dynamic.
How are we doing on time? Okay. I don't have a watch, I don't have my phone. One of the things that struck me is that, a lot of these films on slavery that, some of the ones I've mentioned, I'm sure there's many that I did not, but, they tend to always end on a high, the music just is beautiful at the end. You can kind of close your eyes and be transported to, some really peaceful, wonderful space, sort of right outdoes wrong. And again, these are films that are produced in the US, and they're, on some level, they're making a comment about race and racism and race relations, I guess, in the United States. And so I wonder to what extent you think Amistad supports that kind of American, sometimes historians will call that American exceptionalism or, US exceptionalism. Does Amistad sort of, to your minds, contribute to that?
I don't want to go again. So I'll let you go this time. I have answers, but yes, please.
I do think it supports that narrative. The other thing is that, it's very American-centered. I think the panelists have kind of spoke to this as well. While I am, an American historian, African-American historian, I do the African diaspora. I was very interested in this film from a diaspora standpoint. But you don't always get that. You get the kind of nationalist message. And two, even the returning of Blacks at the end of the film, you can't reverse like the Middle Passage, right? These people are fundamentally changed by their experiences. And two, like they go back to communities that are ruined, right? Sinke, they show up back in Africa and their communities are not the same, right? And so in many ways, the whole narrative of slavery, changes everything, even if you return, right? So it doesn't matter if you return, you're returning to a place that is fundamentally different, right? That is void of, 9.4 to 12 million people, right? That your village may not even be there, right? And so even in the returning, there is still, hardship, there is still loss. Slavery is an awful thing, right? And so, to kind of end it on this flowery note, I mean, I think, today, I think the film would be fundamentally different because, the way in which these stories end is just not great. I mean, I think if you tell the story further of the Amistad and them returning to Africa, what you'll see is that the story is quite bleak.
I was Go ahead.
I was going to say, but what happened with the Amistad in the U.S. was actually indeed exceptional. If from there we want to conclude that the U.S. was exceptional in that regard, that's a different story. But if we take like 3 steps back and look at the big picture, had the Amistad rebels landed in Cuba instead of the United States, they would have been executed. No doubt about it. Let's say that they were lucky and they finally managed to arrive to their homeland in Sierra Leone, in Galinas. They would have been re-enslaved by King Shaka, the same guy who sent it to the ship. Let's say that instead the vessel ended in Brazil. Those people would have been enslaved as well. So, all things considered, the Amistad rebels were lucky after the rebellion that they so successfully win, that they ended in this country, because otherwise they would have been either enslaved or executed. So, if from there we want to conclude that this shows some form of exceptional pattern in American history, be it, but that's something that is important to highlight in this case, in the big picture of slavery in the Atlantic world and in the United States.
One thing I can't remember is if at the end of the film, they, how sometimes they'll bring in sort of like a kind of continuation of what the film no longer shows. Cinque went back to Sierra Leone.
Show that.
And so, I think the high note was that he goes back, the young woman that he was admiring right when he was kidnapped, he marries her, they have kids, but that is not the case. And I think some of the reason that's so shocking and could even be disappointing to the audience is that we don't know, this film doesn't really tell us that history of the slave trade and how, how devastating it was on multiple levels, in terms of, they were at civil war and, was there a kind of relationship between the slave trade and that kind of the civil war that erupted that Cinque went back to and didn't find his family? I mean, what just for our audience, like, what would you say was that relationship?
Absolutely. The place, the Cinque's homeland is southern Sierra Leone. It was called the Kingdom of Galinas, and the king there was called King Shaka. He was from the what we call tribes or ethnic group of the Bai. And this guy was waging war with all the neighbors, the Bulom, the Temme, the Gola. And that's actually pretty nice representing the movie when they are in jail and they start marking territories. This is the Temne, these are the Mende. That's pretty much what he's making reference, the director. And Cinque was captured in one of these raids. There are historians who argue that he actually was in the opposite group, in the enemies of King Shaka. So the civil war that were taking place in this region was the direct cause, and it was actually a consequence as well of the slave trade. The slave trade fed civil wars in Africa, and these civil wars at the same time resulted in more slaves being sent to the Atlantic. It's a very nasty machinery. That's how it works.
So I just wanted to bring up one other thing too, because when we speak about it, the Amistad as being like exceptional in America, and if they had landed in other places, we do have the Creole Rebellion that happened in November of 1841. That's happening almost, right alongside the Amistad. And these, Black people aboard an American ship wind up in the Bahamas, and the British basically free them. So I don't, so sometimes I think that, if they would have wound up with the British, I think that, things could have happened in the same way. And I think that we have to remember the Creole as well, which is getting more attention on the historical landscape as well, because I think there's other places in the world they could have landed and got free as well, right? The British, they had, after they abolished slave trade, remember that they abolished the slave trade first in 1807, then the United States followed in 1808. And the British actually had an African squadron off of the coast of Africa patrolling, trying to stop slave ships from getting, to the Americas. So you know what I mean? I don't think that it is, necessarily that exceptional in America. I think if they would have landed in somewhere in the British Empire, they would have been free as well.
100%.
And maybe they should have landed in Saint-Domingue, in
100%.
Haiti.
Yeah. The only safe places were what you mentioned: the British Empire, Freetown, and the United States, and that's it. Everything else, but the British Empire is very important. Yeah.
I think, of course, yes, the British are very important in Bahamas, but I also think when we think about, again, what happens with this court case and everything in the United States, I think it's also very important. Slavery movement and African Americans who are making all this possible, who are funding all of this, right? That this doesn't just happen by itself, that they are helping push this. Abolitionists in the North, by the way, who by this time, which the film kind of touches on a bit in the attacks on Baldwin, who were not popular, who are thought of as crackpots or lunatics, right? But it is their persistence, and Louis Stepan kind of gets a short thrift by the way he's depicted by Spielberg for whatever artistic reasons. And I think in the Black community, doing to people like Pennington and others who are really pushing this, I think we have to see them as actors in this as well, who make certain and help along, right, these Amistad Africans. I don't want to play counterfactuals like if they weren't there or not, but I simply know that they play this role
And that's missing
in doing
the
so.
movie.
Yeah,
That's missing in the movie.
yeah, that's something, that we really could have seen in that movie to give us a bit more.
Absolutely.
Rather than having the John Williams score, as you said. Is John Williams, by the way, he's the guy who did Star Wars movies and Jurassic Park and Raiders of the Lost Ark. So if your heart starts getting, every time you see Anthony Hopkins, you kind of get teary-eyed. John Williams is doing it to you. And he does it so perfectly in the movie. He brings in those little da-da-da, and you feel nostalgic. You almost want to go out and hug a flag. This is being done to you on purpose, right? These movies are very much playing to that, and it plays it up,
Every time gets my heartstrings going, even as I'm watching and going, something's not quite right. But we could go on, but we want to give other people from the audience here at the Old State House, as well as folks online, we want to give them a chance to jump in. So, yes.
Hi, I think the movies are very important, especially today when we are going backwards where Black history is being banned, that the movies made, like the professor said, that it's got to appeal to people because you got to get money to make the movie. So when we can tell our own story, it's from a different point of view. But I think you go to the movies, you see it, it should pique your interest where you want to go and learn more. Because if these movies were not available, and it's very difficult that everybody's watching junk on TV. So it's very difficult to get people to read stuff that's important. Because I just did a little speech called Sankofa, which means to look back at your history. And I think if more of us knew the real history of America, the real history now, not the whitewash history, then we would be in a better position to move forward. But when you are blocking books, you're trying to say that Black people were just involuntary relocation, whatever the hell that's supposed to mean, like we just decided to come over.
Texas, they're doing that.
You know what I mean? So if you knew your history, you'd have a better understanding of America, period. But until we get that these movies are important, but it's up to you to look further.
Yeah, thank you.
Melina, while I'm just making my way over to the next question, just a reminder to our online audience that if they do have a question, they can type their question into the chat field of YouTube or Facebook, and we'll relay that question here.
Okay, I was wondering if you guys can speak to whether there are distinctive differences in films or popular media about enslavement outside of the U.S. I think of Kilimbo, one of my favorite movies, and perhaps you could speak to some others to give folks a perspective about how enslavement is treated elsewhere, artistically and in narrative.
I'm showing The Last Supper in Cuba, so I'll be showing that in a few weeks. So there's a film that does not end on a nice note. I don't want to give it away on slavery.
And it's based on real events.
Yeah, it's based on a real event, and films. I think it's a great question because films. I would say films on slavery tend to tell us a lot more about the time in which the film was made, and it will also tell us about the region and where it's made, right? And that movie, which has like the eternally running slave rebel, is perfect for a 1970s Cuba, right? Like Quilombo in Brazil. Is made in many ways to talk about it shows this multiracial Quilombo in Palmares that's democratic. That's supposed to be this,
Cecilia.
and it's basically, talking about the police state of the time in Brazil at the time, right? And so it makes Palmares and Quilombo the stand-in. And so I always find it fascinating how films, either here or elsewhere, really have to do a lot with the region and the time period they're made.
I think one of the weirdest movies on slavery I have ever seen is by this Scandinavian director called Lars von Trier. I don't know if you know him. Lars von Trier. He had this movie like Melancholia, Antichrist, but he has one called Manderley.
Yes, Mandalay is extremely bizarre.
It's extremely bizarre. And it's with Nicole Kidman. This woman in the 1930s found this plantation in the South where they still have slaves. And she goes to that community and starts living there. It's a very bizarre movie.
Yes. Who else is in it? The actor from Lethal Weapon. I can't think of it.
Danny Glover.
Danny Glover.
Yeah.
Who's been wanting to make a
It's
movie
a
on the Haitian
trilogy called
Revolution.
America is Manderley, Dogville, and I don't remember the other one. Very bizarre.
Very bizarre film.
Very interesting too.
Yeah, I'm thinking about Black Canada and the Book of Negroes.
Yes.
Which was, Lawrence Hill's book. I'm just thinking about, too, the actual book title. It wasn't called The Book of Negroes when it was released in America. It was called Someone Knows My Name. And so they didn't even release it in America as The Book of Negroes because they thought it would be offensive. Right. And so when it came out in the miniseries in 2015, it was called The Book of Negroes, and it was showed on, television shows television stations like BET. And so that is even political, that it didn't come out as The Book of Negroes. Right. And so also, too, it's just a very interesting narrative because, in this Book of Negroes, which is the actual, real book, of some 3,000 Black people that leave New York City to go to Canada after the American Civil War, after the American Revolutionary War, So used to talking about the Civil War, the American Revolutionary War. And they actually, once they get to Canada, petition to go back to Africa, and the British government permits that. And so it's a very interesting film, but definitely done in a different way that's not, quite, if you will, the American way. And so I would encourage, to look at as many of these films that are made outside of the United States, because they do have a different perspective and come from a different angle at times. So.
Also, by the way, I love the Book of Negroes because it is set outside of the typical American narratives. It is set in the North. It is set during the American Revolution. It has enslaved people who are fighting for the British. And so I love having these other narratives of slavery rather than the kind of same ones we tend to see all of the time that are set in this period just before the Civil War in the United States. So that was great to see.
I guess another one could be Cecilia, which is this movie of this romantic relationship, you can call it that way, romantic, between this woman, descendant of a slave, and this plantation owner.
It's from the novel.
From Cirilo Villaverde novel from the
exactly.
19th century.
Yeah.
And it's a completely different way of understanding race relations as they do in Cuba compared to the U.S.
Yeah.
We have one more question, and it's actually from Mariana at home. She asked, what do you think of teachers showing this movie in classrooms, and what context would you like them to accompany it with?
As a person who shows it in the classroom, I would say that I show, when I teach my slavery and film class, which I'm teaching right now, I actually do it through the history of cinema. And so we start off early on with things like Birth of a Nation, and we move through we're just about to enter in fact, burn the Pontecorvo film. We're about to enter the 1960s and do that, and so we don't show it until later. And what's interesting is by that time, students have got to see a lot about how films are made, the history of films, and so Amistad sits within this context. And they actually critique it heavily because they've seen so many things that they're very critical of it by this time in ways that I think they may not have been if they had seen it earlier.
Yeah.
And so I think you can show film like this, certainly. I think you just have to provide a lot of context. There's a lot of historical changes.
Yeah.
I think historians got involved in this movie and engaged with this movie more so than a lot of others because it purported to present itself as history.
Yeah.
Right? There was even an Amistad toolkit that was supposed to be taught in public schools.
Yeah.
And so I think, and it makes so many historical changes. There's a whole created judge in the film.
I think
because of
12 Years a
this,
Slave
it
was
gets a
similar,
lot of this.
right?
Yeah. Pardon?
12 Years a Slave, I think, was similar.
Was similar,
Yeah.
though it had a lot more praise than I
Yeah.
think than this one because
Yeah.
of all the changes. So, yeah, I think you can teach this, but I think, yeah, of course, it's going to need a lot of. I think as you had said, you can't leave thinking I know the history now because there's a lot of artistic license in here. I think of the interpreter Gibbs,
Yep.
who is made into comic relief simply for the purpose of comic relief, when in real life, he was the one who went out and found the interpreters. And to this day, his family is very angry at the film because their history is that they helped do this, and he's just turned it to comic relief for no more reason than Spielberg needed a joke in the middle of this enlightening. So I think you have to bring in the historical context and have a real discussion if you're going to show this film. Yeah.
Does anyone from our audience here have a question? Going once? One thing I want to ask quickly is, oh, sure, go ahead.
And I agree with everything that's been said. But you know, I had a thought about some of the white characters that are presented in these movies as being, you know, many of them portrayed as self-righteous, full of themselves, and maybe historically, and I don't know if the panelists agree with this, but maybe historically they were that way. Maybe they did see themselves as white saviors.
We could go into it. I don't think if Louis Dupin deserved the way they portray him is like he wants to martyr the Africans, but yeah, certainly I'm sure you could find forms of paternalism at the time. Yeah.
This messianic figure.
Yeah.
Yeah. If I could ask one quick question, just a closing note. As historians and scholars, you spend hours and years researching the kind of information that is theoretically informing a movie like Amistad. If you had one corrective, you said, hey, Steven, you gotta rework X, Y, what would it be?
Like something historical?
Yeah, something that really.
For example, something that is overly exaggerated is the slave trading outpost, Lomboko, the castle. That castle never existed in Lomboko. Lomboko was basically a sand mud lagoon with some wooden made barracoons. That castle that you can find in Ghana or Gore, that never existed in the place where the Amistad came from.
Okay.
So it's overly exaggerated, and it's a huge castle in that movie. So that never happened in reality.
Okay. Yeah. Dexter,
I'm thinking about the African languages. I know they wanted to add some subtitles and stuff like that. And I'm also thinking about one of my favorite authors, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Decolonizing the Mind, where he talks about how language is, you know, political and you know, the fact that those languages didn't show up in the film because somebody, you know, people understand those languages, and that would have really, you know, kind of tied them into the film.
You know, I think that's a good point. And I think I've already said, you know, bring in the black community. Certainly that's one of them. But if I were to, I'll get another one since I already brought that one up. I think going along kind of what you said, by the way, I thought that was hilarious. The part with the slave castle, I was like, what is that? That doesn't exist. And the people running. And I think part of this would be, like to try to dial back some of the noble savage, the differences that the film really seems to be trying to portray. Well, these Africans are very different and they're strangers, and I understand that point. To like talk about that they're strangers in this world, but I think they overplay it, and I think showing the subtitles, showing that they're not going to strip down and start a fire indoors, showing that, you know, where they like, I don't understand that you have courts where they have judges, they have forms of judges and things too. I think they're not going to be like, we're so noble savage, we don't understand lying, and we don't understand not doing the things that you say. And I think there's a way to ease back on all of that. And I understand you're trying to make them dignified, but make them much more human. Make them a bit more complex. I'd love to see, like you said on the ship, that there are these Africans from these different ethnic groups, but they have to find a way to work together and talk. And they like vote. Cinque wants to kill the captain at one point, and they decide to vote and say like, no, don't do that. I'd love to see that instead of them almost using bodily language, like they're almost going to fight it every 2 seconds. And I think you could dial some of that back.
I think it's also about the Spielberg style, because in Schindler's List, it ends also with the liberation of the Jews in Auschwitz, and it's pretty much a similar scene of they are running away from Auschwitz, and the slave castle and Auschwitz. You know, there are many parallels there, and I think he's using the same type of probably recourse.
Well, maybe we need a round of applause for our panelists. Thank you so much to Dr. Dexter Gabriel, Dr. Jorge Felipe-González, and Dr. Dan Broyld. Thank you to the Old State House for having us here.
Thank you.
And thank you so much. That was a fascinating conversation. And I just have to say, I was so happy to hear you speak of the whole community and of Reverend Pennington, because as we sit in this room and think about what happened here, there was a very strong community outside of these walls in this neighborhood at the Talcott Street Church where Pennington was. There was a whole community that really rallied for the Amistad captives and always rallied for each other. And I should mention that this weekend at Capital Community College, they opened an exhibit about the Talcott Street Church, and there are pieces about Pennington there, and also James Mars and others who played such an important role in Hartford, in Connecticut, and in Amistad history. So thank you to all of you for this great conversation, and thanks to all of you who have joined us tonight.